Before discussing planets even further, it's probably a good idea to meet the Sun, the star of our solar system, and also some of its properties. In 264, you'll actually be discussing the inner structure of stars like the Sun. Matter inside the Sun is actually a plasma. This is charged ions and electrons. And if you ever wondered how the interior of the Sun looks like, this is it. This is the core that is sufficiently hot, and this is where fusion is actually happening, the only location within the Sun where hydrogen is being transformed into helium. Outside this core, there is an actual radiative zone. This is still really hot, not as hot as the core, but still really hot. This is essentially radiating energy out until the final region of the Sun, which is a convective zone, where heat is actually transferred to the surface through this convective cells. Now, the Sun, like all main sequence stars, is in balance, and essentially all the time gravity wants to make it collapse, but the heat generated in the core that's then propagated to the surface manages to keep it stable. And in practice, for stars like the Sun, the heat gets to the surface first by radiation or through a radiative zone, and finally through a convective zone. And we can actually observe the convective cells with telescopes from the ground. These convective cells, in case you've never seen them, with a telescope and obviously with a very good filter, because you don't want to become blind by just looking at them. This is how they look like. When you observe them, you can actually see them changing live within matters of seconds, and they're typically something like 1,000 kilometers across. The reason why we can see them sort of changing is because they last only for a few minutes, and therefore if our field of view is capturing lots of them, we can see them sort of appearing and disappearing. The surface of the Sun is actually not homogeneous, and sometimes it can become very heterogeneous, especially because of the presence of these solar spots. They were first seen by Galileo, and essentially solar spots are regions within the Sun's surface where the temperature is lower by something like 1,000 Kelvin. They look dark or even black because they're much colder than the regions around it, where the temperature is more like almost 6,000 Kelvin. Nowadays, we understand that the sunspot activity follows an 11-year cycle. Every 11 years, the Sun becomes very clean, and then after half of that cycle, it becomes full of sunspots. And sunspots appear in this sort of butterfly pattern that is almost symmetric from north-south, and they typically appear in pairs, essentially aligned to the north-south magnetic pole. If you zoom in to one of these sunspots, they're typically sort of tens of thousands of kilometers across. They're still really big, and they're relatively easy to see even with small telescopes, and again, using solar filters so you don't get blind. The reason why they look dark, as I've mentioned already, is because they're colder regions, colder by about 1,000 Kelvin. But if you were to observe these spots without the presence of the much hotter material, they would still shine, they would just be redder. Even though the Sun is quite stable, it actually has a lot of activity that is sometimes a little bit random. For example, the Sun can eject large amounts in the form of prominences and ejecta. And you can compare these with the approximate size of the Earth to understand how big these things can be. And one of the biggest solar prominences ever recorded was in 1973. And again, you can see how massive this is. One of the dangers is, of course, if one of these things is actually released and goes directly into the Earth, our satellites can really suffer, including our entire electrical grid. Fortunately, these things are emitted randomly in 3 dimensions, and it would take a really precise shot to actually hit the Earth. When we discuss Sun's activity, it's probably good to mention the existence of solar flares. They're essentially radiation, often in the form of X-rays, that tend to accompany prominences. Whenever the Sun kind of releases one of those prominences, you also see a solar flare. We know that the source of energy is magnetic. There's a lot of energy that's released whenever this happens. So the equivalent of something like 10 to the 14 megaton nuclear weapons, or 10 to the 30 joules, there is a lot of energy, or essentially 2 billion times the world annual energy consumption. So these phenomena are really, really energetic. And on top of that, we can also see coronal mass ejections, which are essentially associated with the ejection of large quantities of plasma from the Sun, something like 1 billion tons. On the other hand, the Sun is actually continuously emitting a stream of plasma, something we call solar wind. That's not just those discrete packages that we've seen and not just prominences. Solar wind is not as dangerous, and is also more continuous. As the solar wind blows, it actually carries the sun's magnetic field into the solar system. And this solar wind, whenever it's stronger, it can actually drive the magnetic field of the sun a little bit outward into the solar system, versus when it's weak and it only extends a little bit closer to the sun. This is, of course, just a very small introduction to topics that you can explore further in space physics modules. For example, looking at the interaction between the sun's magnetic field and that of the Earth's, and also understanding that many times that interaction can lead to auroras. And this can be seen not only on Earth, but you'll also be able to study auroras in Jupiter or Saturn, which actually have slightly different origins, but the basic physics are really, really similar.